at the home of Mr. Gerald Augustus, the foremost expert in local Loudoun County history. We're so glad to be here. Thank you for allowing us to come.
Always like to share.
First of all, could you tell us about your clothes that you're wearing today?
Well, I had just done a program for the senior citizens, and it was primarily on citizens in the Loudoun County area. So I often wear Confederate uniforms, occasionally a Union uniform. It sort of puts me in the mood. So consequently, today I talked about civilians and I dressed as a civilian.
Well, how did you get interested in the Civil War?
Oh, that's very easy. When I was a child, my father died when I was 2, and I spent a lot of time, summers and whatever, with my grandparents. My grandfather knew a lot of veterans. His father was almost killed by bushwhackers during the war. And so grandmother wouldn't let him smoke his cigars in the house. So we had to go outside, and I literally at grandfather's knee learned my first history, and a lot of it had to do with, as he called it, the war. He didn't call it the Civil War or the War of the Rebellion or Yankee imperialism or anything of that sort. It was simply the war. And so that's where I first got interested in that 1861-65 period.
Okay. I noticed that you've written 2 books on the Civil War.
I have written 2 books so far, one on the Loudoun County area of East Tennessee in the war, 1861-1865, and then almost it goes into it because so much of what happens here then goes up to the Battle of Campbell Station. So I wrote the Battle of Campbell Station, 16 November 1863. If the Lord willing, I'm hoping by next year to have a volume 2 to the Loudoun County. Things keep getting in my way, and I have to get into a certain mindset to do this. And right now I have a bunch of disjointed chapters or whatever, which I'm hoping I'm going to be able to put together. My big thing right now is I'm totally redoing, or not totally, but redoing the Battle of Philadelphia. There's a lot more interesting information has come to light, including the fact that there were 2 women disguised as men in that fight, which is a little bit interesting. Found out why Burnside, when he's ordering more ammunition afterwards, why he was ordering Henry rifle ammunition when I didn't think there were any Henry rifles involved in it. So there's a lot of new things, nothing big, huge, but just a lot of little interesting things and some very interesting stories.
I love human interest stories. As you were writing the book on Loudoun County, and by the way, how long did it take you to write the book on Loudoun County?
I gathered information and wrote for 16 years before it finally came out. I didn't write the whole time, but I was collecting information. And let me tell you, if you ever go to write a book, a history book, the hardest thing to do is know when to quit. Because you always know there's more information. You always know that you could get just a little bit more. And my wife, who was extremely helpful and understanding about me writing and spending all this time and money on getting things and research and whatever, and I found something in a book that was worth a paragraph. It was an interesting paragraph, but nonetheless, that's about what it was. And we had just about gotten the book ready to send to the publisher, and I said, look, I found this, and it'll fit right in here, and don't have to change anything, we just add it in. And she looked at me and she said, I think this is the never-ending book. And that's when I said, well, this is going in. And so then after the book came out, and even before it came out, I was already gathering up more information, and I had a big file called Volume 2. And I just keep sticking little pieces of information. It's like no big startling, but just interesting things. One really good story about Loudoun County.
The human interest stories. as you're writing the book, you shared a couple of those already, but could you share some stories that pop out on your head about anything related to Civil War in Loudoun County?
Well, probably the most famous story that come out of here, and that's because J.G.M. Ramsey wrote his annals, or excuse me, not his annals, but his autobiography, which was never published in his lifetime. But he tells about when William P. Sanders pulled a raid through East Tennessee prior to the main Union forces coming in. And that was led by a fellow by the name of William P. Sanders, who will be killed later on in November of '63. And they will name Fort Sanders, and consequently everything under the sun is Fort Sanders this and that. But Sanders came through and was going to burn the cotton mill, destroyed a lot of equipment that was stored here during the war. He had come in where the industrial park is now, the Loudoun County Industrial Park, found out that every Confederate that they could gather was found guarding the bridge at Loudoun, so he turned to the left and came in into Lenore's. As he came in, Henrietta Ramsey Lenore, who was married to Dr. Benjamin Lenore, was coming out the back door of their house, which is still standing, Ledbetter Apartments, if you're familiar with them. And here comes the whole Union Army. And of course, this is the 19th of June, 1863. They're absolutely covered with dust. You can't tell anything. As her father said, Henrietta called out unwittingly, "Did the Yankees chase you off?" And to one of them, probably Robert Byrd from over at Kingston, said, "We are the Yankees themselves." She ran across Town Creek over to the store about where the old Bacon hosiery mill was, and grabbed the money in the safe and successfully brought it back and buried it. As I say, they were about ready to burn the cotton mill when her husband, Dr. Benjamin Lenore, came up, made Masonic symbols. Some of the officers realized that they burned the cotton, probably 150 bales of it, and let the mill stand. Unfortunately, it stood until the Vandals burned it down in the late 20th century. Stories, if you'll let me go, that's not really that story. Never mind. There's so many good stories. One of the things that I'm very proud of recently, got a little letter from Lizzie Abbott. And Lizzie Abbott lived near Lenore Station. And she had been a student at a girls' school north of Nashville the year before, and because of all the to-dos going on in Loudoun County, or the whole South, I suppose her father kept her at home. But she's writing to her friend, and she said, "Yes, I'm a good secessionist, just like my father is." She said, "The Baptist Church." Now, she could be referring more than likely to Mount Pleasant, Mount Pleasant Hill, Pleasant Hill Baptist Church. She could also be referring to New Providence, but she was closer to the one. So anyhow, she says they're going to try to kick all the secessionists out. The majority of the people were Unionists, and for being a secessionist, you were considered a sinner, and they're going to kick you out. And she also says, ask her friend who's a girl, and she said, "Don't you wish we were boys?" She says, "Daddy wishes I was a boy." Says, "My little brother is only 5 years old." And then she goes on and talks about some other things and asks about some people at her school. And then she ends up near the end of the letter, and she says, "Don't you wish we were hymns? Hymns instead of HIMS, which I think is so typical of teenagers. If you've never raised a teenage girl, you've missed an adventure. Also, along with the teenage girls and whatever, is Julia Lenore. Julia Lenore is the daughter of Albert and Catherine Lenore of Loudoun. Their home stands about 2 miles outside of or west on Riverview Road in Loudon. And she is in a store in Loudon in 1864, February of 64. And she says in a very loud voice, which only little teenage girls can really do, I wish I could see John Hunt Morgan, the Confederate cavalry leader, and tell him just how few Yankees are here so he would come and rescue us. Well, lo and behold, she's arrested, her friend's arrested, and the friend's mother. And they're taken to the provost marshal's office and being held. The mother and the friend sign an oath of allegiance and are let go. Julia refuses. She stays overnight in the provost marshal holdings, where it wasn't a jail per se, but her mother had to come the next morning and get her out by making her take signing an oath of allegiance. This was a defiant bunch down there. The oldest daughter of Albert and Catherine Lenore was Elizabeth Lenore, who had married a fellow by the name of David Key. David M. Key was from Monroe County, had been to Hiwassee College, graduated, became a lawyer, moved to Chattanooga, but fell in love with Elizabeth Lenore. They're married at her father's place outside of Loudon. When the war comes, he becomes the lieutenant colonel of the 43rd Tennessee Confederate. And so he's gone, so she comes back to live with her, by now, widowed mother. And she is there in October of 1863 with Union troops all over the place, constantly visiting the farm, stealing horses, cows, corn, fodder, everything else, hides, a whole lot of things. And she and her mother decide, maybe this is not the best place for the wife of a lieutenant colonel in the Confederate Army to be. So they decide they will go over the Smoky Mountains to Lenore, North Carolina, where they have relatives. And one of the loyal family slaves, an elderly man, hitches up the mules to a wagon. They put straw in the back. Elizabeth, her mother Catherine, and Elizabeth's 3 children. Little Emma, 5 years old, Albert, who's named for his grandfather, 3, and little Kate, who's a year and a half old. And they take off for the mountains. And on their way, Elizabeth keeps telling the 2 older children, don't say anything about the war when we get up into the mountains, because we don't know what side those people are on, and they're probably Unionist. And so they are 2 days out and coming up to the edge of the mountains, and they getting dark, and they see a cabin. And if you don't know what a dog trot cabin is, it's 2 log rooms facing in towards each other with a porch in between and a roof that goes all the way across the top. And there was an old man living by himself, a big beard way down on his chest, they said. And they asked if they could spend the night, and they would fix him some food, and they would stay the night, and he agreed. So the women fixed a meal, and afterwards are cleaning up. And the old man, who evidently hadn't seen many people for a while, took little Albert up on his knee. They're having the best time, just laughing and talking and carrying on. And finally, or all of a sudden, little Albert looks up on the wall and sees the old man's rifle. And Albert says, I wish I had me a rifle like that. And they said, the old man just beamed, and he said, and what would you do with it, sonny? I'd shoot Yankees. And with that, the old man drops the little boy on the floor, storms across to the room on the other side, and they never saw him again. They safely got to North Carolina, where they belonged.